Good day, two-wheel friends. Zach Cords here with Spurgeon Dunbar. Of course, welcome to Season 6, Episode 9 of High Side, Low Side. Coming at you this time around, we've got a Not the News segment, of course. We have a discussion about Moto Blunders European Edition. We'll talk about that with our good friend Henning, who, of course, will stick around for our Rev Trivia game. We'll give away a t-shirt. We'll answer some questions. But before we get into any of that, got to go over to Spurge for a quick word from Motul.
Motul Moto Wash. This stuff is like magic. I keep it in the back of my truck, and whether I'm leaving a shoot or I'm leaving a race with my dirt bike in the back, I spray the thing down with Motul Moto Wash. I pull into, whatever, half-cocked, spray wash place I can find on the way back in the wilds of New Jersey, and I spray it off, and my bike looks clean. Your bike can look clean too, so make sure you keep some Motul Moto Wash on hand to keep your bike looking fresh. You can head over to revzilla.com/Motul to shop all of Motul's cleaning products, and while you're there, make sure you check out revzilla.com/RPM. The RPM program will save you 10% off exclusive brands. There's a 5% cashback deal, and right now, Revzilla is offering a $15 welcome cash package just for signing up. So make sure you check out revzilla.com/RPM for all of the benefits of the RPM program.
Yoki dokie, everybody. Welcome for real this time. And hello to my friend Spurge. Are you ready to kick off? We're almost 3/4 of the way through the season here. Time flies.
It's hard to believe. It is the holidays are upon us, and we're trying to figure out what we're going to do for the season finale. We've got some ideas. We've got some irons in the fire. Obviously, we have the comments episode coming up, but then it's going to be a new year. And man, oh man, I don't know what happened to the past 9 episodes. It feels like we're flying through this stuff.
Agreed. So our Not the News section today pertains to a brand very near and dear to Spurgeon's heart, and that is KTM. KTM, or more accurately, Pereire Mobility Group, the parent company to KTM, purchased 25.1% of MV Agusta. Is that correct, Spurgeon? That comes on the heels of taking over distribution and the service and maintenance for MV Agusta in the United States.
The distribution deal was back in September, I believe.
Right.
Yep.
So, and that also, I think we could sprinkle this in here, comes on the heels of KTM taking over, I think, sales and distribution of CF Moto bikes in Ireland and Northern Ireland, something like that.
I want to say Ireland? England and Ireland.
England and Ireland?
Yeah.
Anyway, point being, KTM is sort of doing if this was a game of Risk, that their pieces would be moving around, those orange pieces, they'd be moving to different parts of the world here. They seem to have a plan for world domination.
It's interesting, and we're going to get into this. The core of the episode that we're talking about today, obviously, is going to be blunders in the motorcycle industry, the European edition. We did this last year with the we did this last season with the American edition. But it's going to be interesting because we're going to dive into some of this. Like, this is not like the acquisition of MV Agusta. Keep in mind when they acquired the rights to Husqvarna from BMW. Wasn't really in good shape. When they acquired the rights to Gas, wasn't in the best of shape. When they acquired the rights to KTM, it wasn't in the best of shape. So they have a reputation of turning brands around. Now, what I will say is MV Agusta has been passed around a bit over the past few years.
True.
But what they're getting with that 25.1% is they're taking over tech support, they're taking over supply chain logistics, and they're going to benefit. MV Agusta is going to benefit from the global net of dealerships that KTM Group has at its disposal.
And you might say that MV Agusta, the MV Agusta brand, stands to benefit from. I'm sorry, you already talked about that. What I meant to say was the KTM brand stands to benefit from having MV Agusta under its umbrella, because sport bikes haven't been the sort of pinnacle of KTM's priorities historically, and it's interesting to see. The brands in and under the KTM umbrella, and how KTM is positioning them. There's a reputation for Husqvarna as being white KTMs basically, which is in large part true.
White and blue.
White and blue, true. So yeah, I'm interested to see where this goes. And I'm not cynical about this. Are you, Spurge?
I'm not cynical at all. I think it's going to be interesting to see how it pans out in the long run. And for what it's worth, I know through inside contacts that KTM has been trying to make En-roads into the street segment for quite a while. And I think oftentimes KTM gets overlooked as a smaller brand, but they're actually, at least in America, they're one of the larger brands because they own so much of the dirt segment and the adventure segment. It'll be interesting to see if they can leverage MV Agusta to get a better foothold on more of the street side of things.
Agreed. Yeah, and I in general, I think MV Agusta is a storied brand, but it's a like you said, the brand has been passed around a little bit, and there hasn't always, in my mind, been a really clear kind of vision or understanding, it seems, for what it represents and how it will move forward, aside from introducing new models that seem sometimes similar. So yeah, I hope it works out well for both companies and for motorcycling. But it is a strange, you do get that kind of uneasy feeling as a consumer and as an enthusiast of motorcycling to think, whoa, what's KTM up to? Like, it's hard not to imagine, it's got a takeover kind of feel.
As far as whether or not it'll be successful, Andy's article kind of wraps up. And if you haven't read it, you can check out Common Tread. What's the title of Andy's article? Do you know off the top of your head?
It is Pereira Mobility Purchases Stake in MV Agusta.
So if you read the article, and I highly recommend doing so, and you get to the end, they sold roughly 333 motorcycles last year, which if you're doing the math, it's a 23% increase over the previous year. So it seems like it's working out so far for the brand.
Fair enough. Well, to determine whether or not that could be classified as a blunder, I say we bring our friend Ari Henning in here and talk about the blunders of motorcycling in Europe.
I think we should get this started. All right, Ari, welcome back to High Side, Low Side. We are bringing you into the fold to talk about European edition of motorcycling blunders.
Love talking about people screwing up, man. That's so much fun.
Well, we figure if anybody has the inside, line on, what it's like to, see some of these European blunders that have been made over time. Have you ever worked on a European motorcycle? And if so, what has that been like for you?
If so, was it a blunder?
Yeah, was it a blunder for you?
Yeah, they're both blunders. One of each, and I told both owners that I would never work on their bikes again. So, yeah, I didn't enjoy it.
I know you did that. You did an old Triumph Twin recently, right? But then what was the other one?
There was an 83 Triumph TSX 750, which our friend Joe Zito informed me is the same mechanical design as like a 1945 Triumph. So just like a total anachronism. And then the other one was a Gilera, which to its credit was purchased in a Sears catalog in like the 60s. But both of them just had engineering issues that I could not wrap my head around.
So I think we're gonna kick things off with a look at the British motorcycle industry specifically, but just so the audience is aware of what we're talking about. Last season we did a motorcycle blunders edition focused on American manufacturers, and now we're going to shift the lens to look at some of the motorcycle manufacturers that have come out of Europe over the past 100 years or so, and some of the mistakes that have been made. Now, what I will say is that because of our age, most of our knowledge is a little bit more recent, but we also all are a bit research focused and can probably talk, I would say, on the fringe of some of the historical topics as well. Anything that I missed there, Zach, as far as kicking things off?
I don't think so. I think you said in as many words that this isn't supposed to be a history lesson. It's supposed to be a reminiscing of things that have happened in history. And if you're not familiar with some of these things, and maybe you'll learn a thing or two. And if you are, then feel free to send us an email about all the mistakes we made.
We'll probably get lots of corrections from crotchety old guys talking about the reliability of Nortons.
Exactly. Well, and that's a great segue, because the first topic that we wanted to cover on Moto Blunders European edition was the sort of collapse of the British motorcycle industry. It's a very kind of Ari and I grew up around vintage road racing, and I think that there's just sort of like a general like swell of of criticism and knowledge and jokes that fly around constantly about how all the sort of major player British brands that were big in the 50s and 60s, your Triumph, Norton, AJS, BSA, those bikes, as the flood of Japanese machines came to America, they all died off because the Brit bikes were all of a sudden they were slow and they were heavy and they weren't reliable and they were expensive and so on and so forth. But that, I think we're gonna dive into that more broadly. That's sort of what happened, and it's in large part, I would say, true. Would you guys agree?
I would say even before the Japanese bikes showed up, like I wish that we had time, and we don't have time to do it on this podcast, but I would love to give each person a blank piece of paper and ask each of us to like write down as many British motorcycle manufacturers that you can think of, because there were so many.
Yeah. Well, I mean, to be fair, same thing with American ones, right? I mean, in the 19 teens and 20s, I mean, there were just loads
guys making
and loads
motorcycles in their garages.
Yeah, totally. And then sort of like weeded out. But yeah, I think it's a fair. I think it's sort of like a fair trope in the motorcycling world that's what happened. But Spurge, you had some interesting notes on why you thought that happened that I hadn't heard before.
So it's interesting. So I have in keeping with high side, low side tradition, where we try to do book recommendations and book reviews, there's a book called Triumph in America, and it's hard to come by these days. This is actually a pretty rare, because nobody bought it, so they stopped making it.
Rare like those vintage Triumphs because they stopped running.
But it's a great look at the Triumph motorcycle industry as it relates to America. But so we didn't have the same distribution network set up in America as when, for example, when Honda came over, Honda set up a U.S. distribution hub, and they had an importer, and they set up dealer networks, and everything was very official. When Triumph, kind of came into America, it started with, there was an individual named Reggie Pink who had a dealership in the 1920s in New York City, and there's some back and forth here. I'll spare you on the details, but Ariel took over, another British brand, took over manufacturing of Triumph in 1936. And because Reggie Pink was an Ariel dealer, he was able to bring in Triumph motorcycles. But then really the name that gets thrown out the most is Bill Johnson, who started Johnson Motors in Southern California. Pasadena was, the main area where they think of his shop being located. And he was basically responsible for importing the Triumph brand into America. Up until that point, Reggie Pink's shop would take an order, and like, let's say Ari wanted a Triumph, you'd come in, you'd place an order, you'd send the order out, and eventually, a few weeks or a few months later, the bike would show up. And Bill Johnson was that was his experience with his first purchase of an Ariel. And he was like, I don't like this. I want to have these bikes on hand. I want to be able to bring them in and be able to sell them. But that lasted until the 1950s. But then what happened was corporate Triumph decided to create their own distributor in Maryland. But they didn't shut down Johnson Motors' operation in Southern California. So you now had Johnson Motors importing motorcycles through his area in Southern California. You had the Triumph Corporation in Maryland bringing in motorcycles, and there was no real cohesiveness, from what I can gather, with the dealership network. And at the same time, you now fast forward to the 1960s when Honda starts coming in, and they're setting up everything, very succinctly. And it was one of those ones where like the cracks were there in the beginning from just a support network of dealerships.
So how was the Honda setup different then? That was like Honda Japan came in and said, we're going to set up a headquarters in North America, and the headquarters in North America will distribute to whoever wants to sign on to be a Honda franchise or Honda dealer. Is that how it worked? How was it different than what you're talking about with Triumph, Spurge, for those that don't know?
Ari, you're shaking your head yes. Do you have any insight you want to throw in there?
I have insights as to manufacturing numbers of what Triumph and the other British manufacturers were doing compared to what even just Honda was doing, and it's tens and hundreds of times more volume coming out of Japan than coming out of the UK. So you're talking about the fundamentals of distribution. The Japanese brands were just much more proactive about it. But even before the issues with distribution, you're talking about bikes coming over the Atlantic to get to the US market. the whole industry was already suffering. Like there was a lack of investment from the government. There was old machinery. There was the manufacturers themselves, guys like Ed Turner at Triumph who like weren't buying new equipment and had a bunch of angry employees that were striking all the time. Like there was a lot of issues that undermined the British bike industry. So like I think that is a good perspective from the American perspective, but from the UK perspective, there was all kinds of stuff going wrong.
Well, I think that's the next step. And again, it's not. I don't want to single Triumph out here, but you talk about.
No, we should single Triumph out.
That's what I would say. That's
Harvard Business School used a study of them as an example of entrepreneurial failure.
That's the other book I have is Save the Triumph Bonneville: The Inside Story of the Meridian Works Co-op, and this book gets into that a little bit as well. But you talk about. It was a nightmare, and I think that's the other side of the coin. One is like, how do you buy the bikes in America when you have competitors that are coming in making it very easy? And then the other side is the manufacturing side. They weren't keeping up with the same technology. So you had, and we talked about this briefly in the American Blunders, but you had this antiquated technology of a parallel twin, and really all Triumph and Norton and BSA had been doing up until that point was, we'll just increase displacement. That's how That's how we make these competitive. We'll just make them bigger. Make them bigger. And all of a sudden, in 1969, Honda shows up with an inline 4 that's smooth and reliable and powerful,
and made out of aluminum.
Yeah.
So how I think there's an interesting in the United States anyway. There is a kind of a feeling, I think, of post-war culture that was booming, right? Post World War II in the United States, I think. There's the baby boom, obviously, but like the 50s and 60s were such a kind of like what's the word I'm looking for? There's just so much
prosperous
growth, and prosperous. Thank you. That's the word I'm looking for. And I think it's easy to forget sometimes that post World War II in the United States was sort of like, cool, we won. Let's go back to our homes that are still standing.
Yeah, we didn't
or
get
our
bombed.
Factories that are still standing. And in Europe, that was really, really bad. There's infrastructure and I mean just straight up geography that was ruined, and not to mention fractures in relationships between nations and that kind of thing. So. Do you think that had anything to do with it? Do you think it was British, the Nortons, the Triumphs? You guys are talking a lot about Triumph, like resting on laurels or still recovering from that kind of thing, which really at that point wasn't that long ago.
But like Japan was still recovering and Italy was still recovering.
That's exactly what I was digging for.
I think it's a cultural thing, man. I mean, it's like Ed Turner went to Japan in 1960. So Ed Turner owned Triumph at the time, and he went to Japan. And I've read quotes from him where he's like, they're super dedicated, they're training engineers, and they're producing bikes, and they're experimenting left and right. Like he saw what was going on, he saw what the competition was doing, and he went back to the UK and he sat in his hands.
Right.
And
I mean,
that's
just
like,
okay.
But there's stories of the workers in the factories trying to sabotage the products, like because they
had Lucas Electronics. They didn't have to sabotage them.
The old Prince of Darkness. But what I will say is that like that was the disconnect. They weren't. You didn't have buy-in from the employees where they were there trying to make things better. They were kind of almost giving up on it as well.
Yeah. I mean, this is going to be an inside joke that only Zach will get, but it kind of sounds like Bonnier Corporation.
Ooh.
Wow. Shots fired. So, you might say that's a whole other podcast. Anyway, I think it's really interesting that because that occurs to me, the whole post-war thing and how Europe was really pretty, battered. But you jumped on exactly what I was reaching for, Ari, which I think is interesting. And granted, it's two different scenarios. It's not the same. But I do think it's interesting that Japan also did not finish World War II on a super high note, I think we can say. And yet the pivot happened, the industrial pivot happened pretty fast. I mean, they started, and the motorcycle industry is not a bellwether for exactly how everything was going in Japan. I'm not saying everything was perfect, but the like you said, Ari, the kind of like, there seems like there was an attitude that changed how motorcycling succeeded in one place and didn't in another, which is fascinating to me.
And it's also the type of bikes, right? Like Japan, Italy, they produce a lot of small, affordable, lightweight bikes because their
Right.
streets were bombed out and they had to start small because people didn't have much. Whereas the Brits didn't have a lot of small displacement motorcycles.
Right.
It just wasn't their jam. Whereas like Honda would sell you a super cheap 100cc bike that would run forever. And they gained market share, and Triumph and BSA and Norton and them were just like, they kind of ignored that segment of burgeoning motorcyclists, people who are like, this is affordable transportation, and focused on their 500s and their 650s and larger motorcycles, which is a different demographic.
I think it's important to note for anyone listening to this podcast that might not be familiar with what we're talking about. When we're talking about large displacement motorcycles in the 40s and the 50s, it's completely different than what we're talking about with large displacement motorcycles today. Because Triumph had, 350s. They had, they did have some smaller displacement bikes by today's standards. But at the time, a 650 Bonneville was a big motorcycle.
That was the Busa.
Yeah, exactly. That was the Panigale V4, totally.
Yeah, so
exactly. That's a good call out.
Honda coming out with 45 or 50cc, 90cc motorcycles was what we're talking about.
Yeah, and then this is a tangent that we don't need to go down too far, but there was also a wing of all this stuff that was happening in a world championship racing stage, right? There were Japanese manufacturers that were going to Isle of Man for the first time in the 50s and the 60s and trying to compete in world GP racing, which had been totally dominated by British and Italian brands, basically, unless I'm forgetting. Maybe some Czechoslovakian one sprinkled in there or something, but European brands. And there was a 50cc world championship and an 80cc world championship and a 125cc world championship and a 250cc championship, and all this. It was a really big deal to win in a small class, and it sort of spoke to the small displacement bikes that these companies were having success selling at home for the reasons that Ari mentioned.
So,
which I think is also super interesting.
Let's kind of take a pause and recap, because we kind of jumped right in head first. And if you're listening to this at home, maybe you're a bit confused as to where we're going for and what we're talking about.
Or if you're listening in the car or at a friend's house, whatever.
Absolutely, yeah, wherever you're listening. So we're talking about the collapse of the British motorcycle industry, and so the foundation here was never shored up. So let's start with what I was talking about, where like there wasn't clear distribution in America. Then to Zach's point, you have this motorcycle boom in America in the 50s and the 60s, and people wanted British motorcycles. They were powerful, they were lightweight compared to some of the American counterparts. There was a desire to have them. Now, to Ari's point, the manufacturing didn't keep up. They didn't innovate. They didn't continue to create reliable, desirable motorcycles, and that desirability fell off. And the real turning point, to kind of, we're all caught up at this point, the real turning point, the way that I see it, and I would be interested to see if the two of you would agree here, is that in the 60s, you didn't have specialized motorcycles, right? So people were buying Triumphs and they were racing them fast on the street. And they were buying Triumphs and they were putting different front ends and suspensions on, and they were taking them desert racing. So there was this huge, and not just Triumphs, but BSAs and Nortons and these other makes and models. I don't want to keep focusing on just Triumph. But then all of a sudden, I think it was like 69 or 70, Husqvarna introduces the 400 Cross, which is like this new dirt bike type thing that changes the way people look at what potentially you could do off-road. You have Japan with Honda introduces a CB750, which changes the perception of what a big road-going motorcycle is like on the street. And Triumph Norton doesn't do anything. Aerials out of, like, nobody, they don't answer with anything, right?
Well, that's not, I mean, I don't think that's entirely true. I don't think that, there was, what's the,
Are you going to argue the Hurricane?
No, I was going to
triple?
No. I was going to, because I think the pivot to dual sport and dirt bike stuff is pretty interesting. And Ari and I were just talking about this for an upcoming episode of CTXP, which will go live at the end of January of next year. We rode 2 vintage dual sports across Wyoming, which we may have mentioned on high side, low side before. But part of that journey was for us was the intrigue around early dual sports and how Honda and Yamaha had both come out in the late 60s with bikes that were basically just a street bike with a high pipe on it. And they were like, neat, it's a scrambler thing.
And that was it.
Yeah, and like a knobby tire. And they're like, cool, have fun, good luck. And then and then Yamaha came out with the DT1, which is like a sort of a real dirt bike. It was a little 2-stroke engine, but it had real suspension. You could sort of race it on a motocross track. And then Honda came out with the XL350, which its predecessor had been an SL350, which was just a street bike with a high pipe, and it was a joke. And then they actually built a real dirt bike. And so that was a big pivot that Japan took. And I don't think that Britain in general didn't do that full stop period, but they didn't do it well enough, certainly, to compete with those
did they
bikes.
do it at all? I'm not familiar with any bikes that they tried to
Well,
build
there was
to compete with motocross.
Tiger, yeah, maybe not motocross. But I'm thinking of like was it the Cub, the Tiger Cub, or the Triumph? You know, it was a little single cylinder dirt bike that Triumph made. I think it was like a 400 or a 4 something. I'm really reaching here.
That speaks to how much of an impression it made on everybody.
Exactly.
I can't think of one, and you're struggling to remember.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of the hopefully, Spurge, I'm packing onto the point that you're trying to make, which is that Japan was forward thinking and pivoted and sort of like moved in directions, and a lot of what the British manufacturers did was say, no, the parallel twin is the way forward, until they were so big that they were rattling ignitions loose and bolts were coming off, and it just wasn't working.
And they kind of rested on their laurels of large displacement motorcycles, but then Japan came for that category as well and did it better.
Yeah, exactly. With like you said, Spurge, the CB750, and then eventually Kawasaki Z1, and so on and so forth.
And I think it's important to note, and I don't want to go too far down this road because it's going to hint at something for the future part of this podcast, but it wasn't just Japanese motorcycle manufacturers. You get to the end of Triumph's original era, which I think they went out of business in '83. So it might have been right around that bike that you were working on, Harry.
Which would make sense.
BMW introduces the GS in, Zach, we were talking about this earlier. You said 1980?
End of 1980 for 1881, yeah.
Triumph responds with a model called the Tiger Trail. And I'm not going to ruin this for anybody because we'll get into this later, but it's like just a bike that they already had in the line that they threw a high pipe on, and they're like, we have a competitor with this German motorcycle that came out.
Like Zach was saying Honda had done, 15 20
years earlier.
prior.
Yes.
Right.
Yep.
Yeah, so just behind the curve. Well, this, I feel great about this discussion, and I think I'd start to pivot out of it. Not that I'm going to cut everyone off if they have one more thing to say, but one thing I want to talk about, Ari, is, do you remember your dad is famous for racing vintage Hondas, and you and I grew up at the vintage racetrack where like I said, there were a lot of these like sort of tropes and jokes about how Brit, but the way you know that a Triumph doesn't have any oil in it is if it's not leaking, then there's no oil in it. That kind of thing. And of course the vintage road racing scene is full of people who just love the bikes for what they are, and it doesn't really matter to them how reliable they are. But do you remember your dad being a famous Honda tuner, sort of like having that mantra about Japanese bikes, about being like, yeah, I just think that they're better? Or
absolutely. I mean, as a racer, there's the whole, in order to finish first you must finish.
Right.
My dad started with bikes that were known to be reliable. But yeah, I think that even though I was raised in the same paddock that you were, my dad was so focused on Hondas and subtly and sometimes not so subtly talked so much trash about other brands that I never really even like gave them much mind. So yeah, my perception has always been that they're unreliable. And yeah, then when I got to experience it myself by working on some older ones, I was like, oh yeah, that makes perfect sense.
I remember reading the Malcolm Smith biography, and I think it was a really interesting indication of things to come, where, if I'm remembering the story correctly, he got a job at like a premier British motorcycle shop. And his job was to like assemble the Honda Cubs when they came in, because the real mechanics wouldn't work on them, right? Like they wanted to be focused on working on these big, high-powered British motorcycles, because there was a time and place where the British motorcycle scene in America was like, that was the top of the performance game that you could get.
Right. It was
So
the pinnacle,
that's how he started. He would put together these Honda Cubs because nobody else wanted to do it, and I think he was getting like $5 for assembling, or maybe it was 50 cents. I don't know, inflation. But the story goes where he ended up making so much money because the Honda Cubs just started selling, and that's how he kind of got his start learning how to work on certain things.
Yeah.
Nice anecdote. That's fun.
Yeah, it's interesting. So I think that we can come back to this topic to some extent as this conversation moves on, but that's kind of a cornerstone, I think, of European moto blunders, or it's at least it's a it's a massive thing that people often point to in the culture shift of motorcycling, is how the sort of the British powerhouse brands faltered when faced with all this competition from Japan. But I'd like to pivot, if that's okay, Spurge.
I was just going to say, so just in conclusion there, just because I want to make sure that we're hitting this for people that are on the fringe, like maybe you're listening to the podcast and you're not as tuned in to the 1950s motorcycle scene as somebody else.
Super tuned in.
Yeah, exactly. But like, you look at the British motorcycle, the collapse of the British motorcycle industry, and it went from like the early 1900s where you had all these brands. I would say the pinnacle was in the 50s and the 60s, and then in the 70s, when the motorcycling was at its height in America, British motorcycling was on its way out, to the point by the 1980s there were no British manufacturers left at all. Mm-hmm. Does that sound about like the good roundup there of what we talked about with the collapse?
Right.
Yeah, sounds like a good summary.
The British Empire faltering.
All right.
So
take us away, Zach.
Well, I'd like to move to the next topic, which, they're all related one way or another. But the next topic we had written down was doing American cruisers wrong. And I think this is a super fun topic to pick at for just a minute, because there is, for all the American blunders we talked about in our Moto Blunders America edition, Harley Davidson, and to a lesser extent other American brands, India and so on, have had really good success with the sort of heritage aspect and the speaking to American culture with their
cultural
motorcycles.
aspect.
And they've had massive success. Harley Davidson is a huge company and has sold a lot of motorcycles. And over the decades, brands from all over the world have come at Harley Davidson, or not specifically, but come at Harley Davidson market share, right? They want some of that cruiser market, especially in the United States, because it's so big. And in large part, it's been just an absolute bloodbath. And we were chewing this over, Spurge. You mentioned the Ducati Indiana, which is I think a late 70s V-twin.
Well, let's ask. So let's do guest honors first.
Yeah. Fair enough. You're right.
To your point, Zach, like when we talk about market share, at one point, I think Harley Davidson had like something like 50 or 60% of the market share in the U.S. because they were selling cruisers. So yeah, there was a piece of the pie that these manufacturers all wanted. Ari Henning, what is a European cruiser that you could think of that might not have been so great in your mind?
All of them. But specifically, like more recently, we did a CTXP episode with the R18, which, especially for BMW. So the BMW R18, for those that don't know, is a massive twin, cylinders poking out in either direction. Just the proportions of it are absurdly large. It's a beautiful item, but to ride it, especially when BMW is usually so pragmatic and so refined in their engineering, to ride a motorcycle that drags hard parts that readily and steers the way it does and doesn't actually have very good brakes. We had this conversation, Zach and I and Spencer, where it's basically like they almost had to like turn their brains off. They're like, this is how the Americans do it. Let's just not be as good at engineering as we know we can be and make a motorcycle. So that's the most recent bike, and it's not their first attempt at an American cruiser. Right.
We did that CTXP episode about Harley Davidson versus BMW. It's sort of an interesting dichotomy of bikes that they had aimed at each other. And we talked about the BMW R1200C, which
that one immediately comes to mind as like,
but it's
top
a great,
of the list.
It's a good motorcycle. It's just a terrible cruiser. Because they did what BMW does, and they're like, it needs to work well. It needs to steer and stop and shift and do all the things that a motorcycle should. It was just heinously ugly.
And it didn't resonate with people, right? It's almost like you need some sort of like secret key to unlock what people care about in the American V-twin, or the sort of like American cruiser style game. And it's been almost impossible for anyone else to do.
A genuine secret sauce.
Yeah, exactly. I think the R18's a great... Have you ridden an R18, Spurge?
I feel like I have
You feel like you have because you've
feel
heard
like
us
I
complain
have.
about it.
No, I feel like I have. I just don't. I don't. It would have been at like a dealer like taking one out for a quick spin. It wouldn't have been like a press bike or any extended
Right.
period.
Well,
So
even if you
Yeah.
turned out of a parking lot, you would have dragged hard parts and you would have remembered that.
I think it's interesting because like I remember having a conversation with somebody that was a huge fan of the R1200C, and it was like just like a casual conversation, and I remember almost putting my foot in my mouth because I was about to like just all over it, and this guy was like, "No, it's like one of my favorite bikes in my garage. I have 2 of them," and I'm like, "Oh yeah, great, awesome,
Yeah,
good for you."
it's got a cult following for sure.
It does have a cult following.
So what other bikes come to your collective minds? Spurge, I know you got a couple on your list.
The top on my list, and I threw this one out. Zach and I were talking earlier, is the Ducati Indiana.
Right.
And I think we might have talked about this before on the podcast with like when we did like worst motorcycles ever or ugliest motorcycles ever or whatever that episode was.
It's
but
not
like,
doesn't it? It just looks like a VT 700 or like a Virago or something. Like it looks.
Yeah, it looks just
appropriate.
like
it's a
Yamaha
V
Virago,
twin.
Yeah.
yeah, I think it looks hideous. It doesn't look like a Ducati. It doesn't look anything
No.
like if you took the badges off of that and I said, "What motorcycle is this?" There's not anyone in 2022 that would be like, "Oh, it's a Ducati." They nailed it.
Yeah. Well, it's not technically. It's not a Ducati. It's a Cagiva with the Ducati engine. Cagiva owned Ducati at that point. But that's a tangent.
That's actually going to fit in with maybe another topic of like reviving European brands. But yeah, we'll save that for a minute here.
So
Yeah,
I
and
think
I heard that Indiana was supposedly like kind of fast, but it just handled super bad.
And it was hideous.
I don't think it was that ugly, but
I
it
disagree.
looked like all the others. It blended in wonderfully, in my opinion.
that's how I feel about it. Is that I don't think it was any worse looking than those other bikes. I just also think those other bikes are horrendously ugly also.
Yeah, there we go.
But
Ugly like the rest.
Yeah, ugly like the rest. Spurge, you were talking about Triumph cruisers because
in a more modern era, and I think
Right.
it kind of ties into what we just were talking about. So the transition is, it's important to note that Triumph, obviously, if you're listening to the podcast, is a brand today. But they did go out of business in the early 80s, and then John Bloor bought them and revived the brand.
but we're not talking about revival brands yet.
Not yet. Nope.
Okie doke, just making
but
sure.
I'm just setting a template here that
Sure,
when we are talking
sure.
about these motorcycles, this is more of a modern era.
Yes.
I think from a reliability standpoint, when you're looking at things like the original 2004, 2005-ish Speedmaster and America, they were the same bulletproof, reliable 865 parallel twins that were used in the Bonnevilles and the Thruxtons, but they just desperately were trying to go after like the Sportster crowd, and it just wasn't competitive when put up against like a Sportster 1200. And there was a time where those bikes were selling new for like $7,000 or $8,000, but they were selling used for like 20. You could get one for like $2,500 because nobody wanted one.
Right.
I just didn't think the styling was that great. The seating position wasn't that great. Zach, you brought up the Thunderbird, which was a later cruiser
Right.
that they made, and I remember the story around that was
and that's a bigger one. That was like a 1200
1600. It was
Was it a
1600.
parallel twin though?
Yeah, it was a parallel twin.
Yeah, it was a huge parallel twin.
Huge
But that
parallel
was
twin, exactly.
that was the big thing. Was at the time they were like, no, you can't make a parallel twin that big. And I remember reading a story somewhere where it was almost like a challenge. We're like, no, it'll vibrate you to death. You can't have one. And they're like, we're going to solve this. We're going to solve the problem that nobody actually needs solving. And they built this giant parallel twin. The engine had a lot of character to it.
We're going to answer a question that nobody asked.
Exactly. But like my problem with that bike was it was just really uncomfortable. You were
Really?
kind of locked
I
in
didn't
in a position. I remember
Yeah.
as a taller rider being very kind of cramped on it.
Yeah.
So even though it was a bigger, more powerful cruiser, it wasn't more comfortable. It wasn't comfortable enough for a larger rider to really enjoy.
But it worked though. Like I rode that Triumph Thunderbird back to back with it was a Harley and maybe an Indian, or maybe it was like a Suzuki Boulevard or something like that. I forget. I did some test for a cruiser magazine at some point with a Thunderbird.
Was that when we rode that souped up Thunderbird that Mickey Cohen built?
No, that was a Rocket. That was
yep.
That was
Even
a Rocket
bigger
3.
engine.
Even bigger
Yeah.
engine, which I'd like to talk about that bike in a minute. But because I think that's actually a good segue. the Thunderbird was a good bike. I thought I rode around and remember like going through some curves on a road and being like, stuff's not dragging. It works pretty well. It's got good torque. It like does all the things. And yet somehow it's missing that mystical thing that makes people want it. And I think in my mind, where European brands have had the most success creating cruisers is sort of like the muscle cruiser thing, right? Ducati Diavel, Triumph Rocket 3, because it's a cruiser, but it's like, it's got a different spin. It's not actually trying to be a Harley Softail or a Fat Bob or something like that. It's its own thing. And yet they're not big sales successes, right? They don't sell a ton of Diavels as far as I know. And certainly nothing compared to Street Glides or Fat Bobs or a Dyna or something like that back in the day.
Even looking at, and this gets back to Ari's comment earlier, like you look at the Thunderbird, the engine was great. It was reliable. It was polished. Like, was it just too polished? Was it too,
was it too good?
Was it too well manufactured?
We're asking questions that are being asked in a lot of boardrooms by manufacturers other than Harley Davidson, and no one else has been able to solve it. So I don't think we're going to be able to either. It's a conversation that lots and lots of people have had. It's hard to nail down what makes a Harley a Harley.
Introducing the RevZilla Cruiser, 9 cylinders, 45 feet long.
But I
all
think
pointed in different directions.
But I think when you look at all of the, like, I think what was unique about the Rocket 3 and the Diavel was they weren't trying to go after that twin segment, right? It wasn't like, oh, we're going to try and create a parallel twin to compete with the V-twin or a boxer.
But they had
twin
the silhouette. They were trying to do a different engine configuration, which was to their
feel
benefit.
like
But they were definitely trying to nail the silhouette.
Yeah, they're trying to put you in the same riding position, more or less, kind of.
I feel like the Rocket 3 silhouette and the Diavel silhouette was a bit more powerful. I mean, like, look at the size of a Rocket 3.
They're power cruisers, but like Harley did that too. Like, it had a V-rod. They were definitely, I think what I'm trying to say is those two motorcycles, when they sat down and decided what demographic are we after, it's people who typically would buy a Harley Davidson. Do you agree with that?
I would agree with that.
Yeah. Well, that's what they were trying to do anyway, is what you're saying.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think that doing American cruisers wrong is a blunder of the European motor industry, but it's
a great tradition.
I think what the thing that I'd like to land on last of all here is that you can't blame them, right? There's a huge market
business,
share,
right? They're trying to sell bikes.
They're trying to and everyone said it was horrific when Porsche built an SUV. The purists were like, I can't believe it, but it's a boon. They sell a lot of them, and now like Porsche's a bigger company because of it. So. You kind of can't blame them for doing it, but it certainly hasn't necessarily worked out all that well.
Plus, it gives us something to talk about.
Perfect, exactly.
But just to your point, Zach, my question for you is: so you feel like the Rocket 3 and the Diavel are examples of European cruisers done right? Is that what you're trying to get at there?
Yes, I do, because I think they're excellent bikes. I think they're engaging and they're fun to ride, and they put you in sort of a cruiser position. They put you in that scofflaw slouch. You feel like you're a bad boy or girl.
They offer something that you can't get in an American cruiser.
That's true. Yeah.
Okay, so my question I'm sorry, Zach. My follow-up question there for you is that you said that you liked the Thunderbird. You felt the Thunderbird was a great bike. You also feel that the Rocket 3 and the Diavel are a great bike. Where's the split there for you personally? Like, why was the Thunderbird not a great example that the Rocket 3 was?
I think my point is Europe has produced some cruisers over the years. Some of them have been just a direct aimed at a Harley Sportster or aimed at a certain Harley Davidson model, whether it's the R18 and the Harley Softail or the Triumph Speedmaster and a Sportster, whatever it is. Some of them are directly, like, it's so clear what they're trying to do. And then some of them are this totally different take and of sort of a power cruiser thing, like a performance cruiser, because Ducati's a performance brand. And some of them are worse motorcycles than others. But in general, I've never ridden a European cruiser that was truly bad to use or truly worse to ride than a Harley or an Indian.
What about
Ari's raising his hand.
R18 versus Softail. The Softail is a genuinely better motorcycle.
Right, which I think so that's the one exception that comes to mind, and I think it's interesting because all of those other bikes that I mentioned are not bad motorcycles, but they don't work in the way that they were supposed to in so much as they're not big sales successes and they don't pull people away from Harley Davidson. And the R18, I think the reason that it's so intriguing that the R18 is worse than a Softail is that it, like Ari said, it almost seems like they did it on purpose. They said, we're going to make it longer, wider, heavier, and just worse than a Softail, and see if that's what.
See if that works.
See if that works.
Before and it didn't work, so let's try again.
Doesn't seem to be working as far as I can tell.
Yeah.
But my point is, Spurge, that the wide, like, sort of diaspora of bikes that has been created by Europe to go after the American V-twin market have a similar sort of success rate, regardless of whether they're good or not.
Okay. And then my follow-up question for the both of you, because this is one that just came to me. It's not written down on my piece of paper, but it's one that I think we should at least, maybe wrap up things with or kind of throw in here to the hat. What about the Triumph Bobber?
I forgot about the Triumph Bobber.
Super
Yeah,
unique.
you know why you forgot about it? Because it's not a huge sales success, is it? Maybe it is.
It was a decent motorcycle, other than having a horribly compromised riding position, because it's the same fundamental structure that they used with other bikes.
Yeah. And that's a perfect example.
It's a little bit different, right? Like I can't think of any other bike that's going after that it's going after. They tried to create something a little bit unique with that motorcycle.
I think it's great. I really like that bike because I think it's a slightly more standard riding position. It's not quite as clamshell as American V twins tend to be, like an Indian Scout or something like that. But it doesn't go after any sort of performance, ambition. It's not trying to be rocket fast.
It's a stance. It's a look.
Yeah, exactly. And I think when BMW came out with the R18 and I rode the R18, I was disappointed in the way that it looks, disappointed in the way that it feels. And I think that BMW would have been better served. I don't know. That's the wrong phrase. I have no idea if they would have been better served. I would have liked it better if BMW had done something more like the Triumph Bobber, because I think the Triumph Bobber is genuinely interesting. I think it looks cool. It looks unique and it works well. And yet there's no way they sell more of those than Harley does any of their models, right?
Yeah.
I don't know. That's one that
Harley.
I did. I remember when that bike came out. Like I remember seeing it on the showroom floor and being like, "This is a sharp looking bike." Like I like the way this looks, and that the engine that big parallel twin. I think it's a 1200 in that one. Like, just fantastic engine. And I think probably the shortcoming of the Bobber is that like when it was just like the single seat. And so, like, if you wanted a passenger, if you wanted saddlebags, if you wanted accommodations, like, it really was a one-trick pony. It was kind of like a Honda. What was it? Was it a Honda Fury? That was like,
Fury. Don't mention that bike.
That's a whole other podcast.
Speaking of, it's not a European failure, but speaking of failed cruisers,
we'll get into that. We'll get into that when we get into the Japanese edition of.
Yeah, when we get to Japanese.
There we go.
So, Spurge, I know you've been kind of dying to talk about the revival of brands because you're a Triumph fan, as I think you have right to be. Triumph's a modern, cutting edge, leading company, in my opinion. But they weren't always, as we said, they went belly up in the 80s, right? And then John Bloor, et cetera, et cetera. So maybe you want to start with the tasteful revival of brands as a segue into the distasteful revival of brands?
I mean, I think we could try that. I don't think it's interesting because like when we were going through this episode, we were trying to come up with different buckets to put everything into. And the bucket for topic number 3 that we're going to move into now is the distasteful revival of brands. But I don't think Triumph falls into that. And I think that's what Zach's alluding to because when you look at what John Bloor did, I remember somewhere, and I was trying to find this article of where I read this, but I remember John Bloor, who bought the rights to the Triumph name, somehow went over and like toured these Japanese factories. And at the time, the manufacturing powers that be in Japan invited him in. They were like, "Oh, he'll just bring him on in. He
like
look at
what's
our
his toast did, right? What was his name, Ari?
Good question.
The guy.
Let me check my notes.
but
Ed Turner.
Ed Turner, who went over and did the same thing.
Who was also welcomed. They revered him because at the time the British motorcycles were the bee's knees.
So they brought him in, and unlike Mr. Turner, Bloor came back and said, "This is how you do it. This is how we're going to set up. We're going to go modern all the way." And
this is how you do it: righty tighty, lefty loosey.
And like I would say, like the standardized, like by that point, the metric system. What was when you were working on that '83 Triumph? What were was it Whitmore?
It was a combination. It was the worst. It was a combination of SAE, which is what American SAE, Society of Automotive Engineers, inch based, and then Whitworth.
That's what it was.
Ever heard of Whitworth? It's
Yeah, that's the place where you can get jackets and
the
stuff,
nominal
right?
dimension is the diameter of the fastener. So like a 5/8 Whitworth, it's 5/8 for the shaft of the bolt. Whereas like if you take a 5/8 SAE, it's 5/8 between the flats. So you can have like 2 wrenches, a 5/8 SAE and then a 5/8 Whitworth, and it'll be, they say the same thing and they just look entirely different. It was the original standard. It was the first standardized thread pitch, but it went the way of the dodo.
Yeah. Yeah. So the important thing is, as far as tasteful revival of brands, I think Mr. Bloor gets a big golf clap from myself as far as creating, Triumph in the modern era. And I think that's probably the biggest success story. I do think it's worth, we kicked off this this podcast with a talk about, KTM. And I think the revival of the KTM brand and the Husqvarna brand and, now the Gas brand are probably ones that are, success stories as well.
All right, agree? KTM fanboy, stay on track. If we're gonna talk about other, we should also mention, we did mention Indian in the American edition, but I think that's another example of a tasteful revival of a brand that's like doing good things.
Did we miss any, Ari? Are there any tasteful revivals that we missed?
Not that I can think of, honestly. Like Triumph, definitely. You already said it, but I'll say it again. Like they deserve it. Like they're one of, in my opinion, the best brands out there now. And I think for a lot of people who are listening to the early part of this conversation, being like, why are they talking so much trash about Triumph? Like there was a huge transition. The company closed, the company reopened. It was totally revitalized, and now they build switch washes of motorcycles. They're just such great bikes. Every time I ride one, I'm like, man, this makes me a better rider. So it's an interesting dichotomy that they were. Dare I say, trash at the end of the previous era, and now they're excellent.
Yeah, it's super interesting. And so, I think that's in some ways a good segue to this discussion of distasteful revival of brands, because you can see why people with money put resources behind a storied brand to try to bring it back to life, because it has been done and it has been done well. But there are certainly, when it comes to Europe, been some not so good. Well, we've talked about Norton on the podcast before, which has spent the past decade or two sort of going in and out of the spotlight with new bikes they had an Isle of Man TT Superbike that John McGuinness raced, and they had,
it was a V4,
of course,
right?
There was a V4, yeah, and then they had a new parallel twin that was sort of gorgeous looking, and then infamously, recently, the sort of like financial collapse scandal, basically.
Yeah, scandal.
The company.
That's a good word for it.
And it's a bummer for the two-wheeled world, but it's especially sad considering it's the brand of all that.
It's a storied brand.
lore.
Yeah, it's a historic and prestigious brand.
But what else you got? Anyone else? Chime in.
I mean, Royal Enfield got brought back, and they've done a pretty good job. And that's an interesting story, because it was Indian versions of British motorcycles, and then it went on to do its own thing. And they even imported equipment, as I recall. They imported manufacturing equipment from the UK. But that's gone off on its own and done well. And
now they have a design center and have set up shop in England. So it's this odd thing where like there was like, colonizing that happened, and then they sort of left behind a brand that then grew into something that was good, and then as a very complicated, whatever global political conversation.
Involved.
Yeah, I don't really want to dive into that.
I wouldn't say that was distasteful. That's just another revival that springs to mind.
Yeah,
I think that the reason that I was hoping somebody was going to bring that up, and I'm glad that you did, Ari, because I think that sits somewhere in the in-between. I think it's a tasteful revival of a European brand, but it's been revived by an Indian firm. So it's not really it's not really in the same light as like Triumph.
So I don't know if this is what you're reaching for, but it would be a tasteful revival of a European brand, but it wasn't Europeans that did it, so they don't get any credit for it.
They don't get any credit for it.
I like it. So another one that comes to mind for me is Benelli, which was a storied competition, racing brand from Italy way back when. And the Benelli brand, I think, is sold off to a Chinese company, or the bikes are made in China anyway. Modern Benellis are, and they're less than prestigious or luxurious, I would say. Do you think that's a fair?
I would say they're horrible. Like
Okay. Well, that's another take on it.
we have a Benelli 300 sitting out in the Philadelphia office here because we got one for free, and that kind of gives you an indication of the value
Of how valuable they are.
But I took it for a ride, and again, I know that we joke around a lot, but like it's legitimately a bad motorcycle. The clutch
that
is
we
almost
joke around
impossible to use. Like it's if you have, and it's like $5,000. So if you have the opportunity to buy that or like a Z400,
Right, Ninja 400. Yeah, exactly.
I am not impressed with what the Benelli line has come up with under its new ownership.
I think this. So that reminds me of a conversation Ari and I and our old boss Mark Cook at Motorcyclist Magazine had years ago. We did a roundup of a bunch of bikes. I don't remember what it was. It was a whole bunch of single page articles in the magazine, just like quick rides on stuff. And we gave them all star ratings and by far the least favorite bike we had rode for that test was a Moto Guzzi V7 area, and I don't remember
When
which one.
Spurgeon, I don't either, but there was a bunch of iterations. But when Spurgeon was describing how bad the Benelli was, in the back of my mind, I was thinking of that V7.
Well, yeah, I think so. I think it was a cafe of some kind, like V7 Cafe maybe. And it was just beautiful.
Gorgeous
Moto
machine.
Guzzi's
Yeah, it had the like the straight lines in the tank, like the coffin tank and the side covers, and it had a number plate,
like
I think.
It had like the chrome. Remember the chrome tank?
Yeah, it's beautiful.
It was so pretty, and of course, Moto
But
Guzzi's
we all
had that,
stalled
like,
it so many times.
Exactly. That's what I was going to say. We kept on every time we would like ride around. And Mark Cook said the same thing. We came to the office one day and he was like, "Man, I haven't felt like a worse rider than in a long time. Like I stalled that bike 3 times on the way to work, and like I've been doing this for 30 years. What the heck happened?" And I think is it a bad motorcycle? Like, is it dangerously bad? Not really, but like that's kind of what makes the difference in the modern era, I think, between a good and a bad bike. Sometimes it's just sort of like how easy it is to use. And Ari, like you said, you ride a modern Triumph of some kind, and you're like, man, I feel like I'm great at this because it's just easy to use.
Mm-hmm. I remember my dad came to me recently and was like, so let me just, and he'll do this. I get the Spurgeon Senior questions. It's like, a Wednesday at like 11 o'clock in the afternoon, and I'll get a text and it's like this bike versus this bike. And we play this game. But he was like, what about a V7? He's like, if I could get like a V7 or like a street twin.
Because he likes V-Stroms, right? So like a V7, like ipso facto.
But also Spurgeon Senior and my dad, Timko, also, my dad comes to me about Moto Guzzi V7s all the time also. And I think it's the same.
Like, Dad, don't do it, man.
But
he's like, it's beautiful.
It's beautiful, and it looks like an old Guzzi. Is this what your dad says too, Spurge?
Yeah, and but he'll always compare it with like that or a street twin. And like if you're looking at the two, the Triumph is just so much more refined and polished at this point.
Fantastic machine.
Yeah.
They get you with the good looks, man. The Moto Guzzis.
Oh, so okay. I think Moto Guzzi's like the shift to like focusing on like an Italian brand. I think that is an example of. I look at a lot of the Moto Guzzis now, and there's some that I think they're good looking machines, and I think in some cases, Moto Guzzi is doing European brands right, but maybe the V7 is something that just needs to be kind of polished a little bit more. What's the new Sport Tour that they just came out with?
The V100 Mandello. Which our friend Andy Greaser rode and said he thinks it's quite good. And to be fair, I told Ari and I told the anecdote about the V7 and Mark Cook and Motorcycles Magazine years ago, and being like, man, we just kept stalling the damn thing, and like, are we just bad at this, or is the bike not that good? We had one of those V85 TT Moto Guzzis around last year sometime in the West Coast office, and it's not a BMW GS. It just isn't. I mean, it's a BMW GS from 1988 is what it is.
Yeah. And similar to the way the Royal Enfield Himalayan is an old school bike.
Yeah, it feels very antiquated. And it's not necessarily a bad thing. It's a very satisfying bike to ride in a lot of ways. It's just kind of not modern in a way that you sometimes think of a bike being when it has traction control and a TFT screen. Quick side note, our friend Spencer Robert wrote an excellent article.
Loved it.
If you love reading words, he really liked that bike, and he wrote a great article on Common Tread about the V85 TT. So point being, I don't want to lump Moto Guzzi in with this distasteful revival of brands by any means, because I think Moto Guzzi is. I like Moto Guzzi, but
it's important to understand that when you ride a Moto Guzzi, you have to have different expectations. It's
Nice.
not going to be like getting on a Honda or getting on a BMW.
Well said.
Even though the price point might be the same and the specs are the same, it is going to be a very different experience.
So I have yet to ride the V85. Would you compare? Like, I know that sometimes it gets compared to the V-Strom. Is it comparable to the V-Strom or no?
No. I mean, I don't think
You
so.
don't think so?
Think of it. Well, I mean, maybe from like
In
an
spec
overall.
it is, right?
Yeah, I guess so. What I was going to tell Spurgeon, which he's not going to like, it's a bigger Royal Enfield Himalayan. It's
I don't like that.
I know, because you want a KTM with 19 inches of suspension travel that you can slam into a log and just like have it hop over, because you're like a dirt bike guy. It's not a dirt bike. It's like a lopey, old, charming. But have you ever ridden a BMW GS from 1985 or 1988?
That's exactly what I was going to say. I was going to be like,
Yeah.
if you want to
80s
compare
GS.
it to a mid-80s GS, it's a perfect comparison.
Yeah, it's like that. It's like riding an adventure bike from the 80s,
Fair
and
enough.
which isn't bad. It's just not what you want, because you're Spurgeon Dunbar.
Stop
Log
it.
Slammer.
Stop it. Log Slammer. That's a
Slammer
great
Pro.
that's a great nickname. Old Log Slammer.
Yeah, old Log Slammer Dunbar.
So-
All right, well, we should move on, but I'm going to let you take the next bit.
I know from just kind of wrapping up distasteful revivals. This is one that, like, I've yet to ride these, but I was in Europe. Oh my gosh, this was back before the pandemic. It was for I think it was Intermot. It was either Intermot or EICMA. It was one of the two. And they had a display, and Zach, help me pronounce this. It's FB, is it Mondial?
Mondial. I think.
Mondial.
I think, yeah.
So that is something where apparently and I knew nothing about this, but I saw this little display. They had these really great looking little like 300, 400 cc scrambler sport looking motorcycles. I have an article up on Common Tread from a couple years ago. But what I will say is that I didn't realize that was originally an Italian brand from the 1920s, 1930s.
Storied, yeah.
Yeah, and then now they're being revived by, I believe, another Indian firm, if I have that correct. But that's one where
I sense a pattern here.
But it's interesting. It's like that one. And again, this is me not having ever ridden one, but looking at them and seeing them in person, the fit and finish seemed amazing. And I would say that might be an example of one that was maybe that in between, like we were talking about with Royal Enfield, where it was like a successful, revival, but not done by an Italian firm.
Yeah. Well, in that case, they don't get credit for it. Sorry.
There you go.
Not
Zach's
in this
hard with the
podcast
rules.
anyway.
Well, when we were doing pre-production, we also talked about Bruff Superior, which is for those who don't know, it was sort of in line with like a Vincent or something like that back in the day. It was sort of a luxurious
High end
V twin. Yeah, exactly. Kind of the affluent, high performing bike of the 19 somethings. I don't know, whatever. Old. It was a long time ago. And there was, I think, a French millionaire or a French firm or something like that revived him. Spurgeon, you pointed that out, and you said, "Oh, is that a distasteful revival?" And I kind of disagree with that. I was like, I don't think it's distasteful. Like they made like a new version of an old bike that costs $100,000, and it's this sort of museum piece. So is it distasteful? I don't know. It's arguably too tasteful, because no one's going to buy one because they're too
But I mean,
expensive.
that stands in line with what the originals were.
Yeah, exactly.
The originals
So I mean,
were
that's not- yeah.
the epitome
Yep.
of motorcycling. So
Yeah.
All right. Well, we have more topics to jump into, but let's take a quick break and get into a word from our sponsor, Motul.
All right, boys. We can move on with this discussion now of the greatest blunders in the history of Europe. That's actually too broad. We're not really talking about that. The next topic we wanted to talk about is the reliability stigma around European motorcycles, because, and this, it's hard to say this is a blunder that Europe has made as a motorcycling nation, maybe, but it is true. Would you guys agree? And we've touched on this already a little bit, that European brands have suffered with a bad reputation for reliability in the past. Certainly because of the
mechanic to go first on this one. I want to hear.
Yeah. Well, we sort of
Touched on it, yeah.
Yeah, we touched on that a little bit. But what would you say? Do you think that that reputation has transferred to modern day European brands, and do you think that's fair to any extent, Derry?
I don't think Triumph has transferred necessarily, because I think it was far enough in the past that there's a lot of people that don't remember and don't know. And then the only current brand that really springs to mind, I mean, MV Agusta kind of springs to mind just because MV Agusta and Aprilia, because their dealer network is so sparse, and people are always like, if you have an issue, which you will because it's Italian, then you can't get parts. I can't actually speak to that, but Ducatis, up until very recently, have definitely had extremely demanding service intervals and expensive because it's a boutique bike. So you're going to get charged a bunch for the service, and they need valve clearance intervals every 7,500 miles or 10,000 miles, and they need belts replaced and all this crazy stuff, which they've dealt with recently. They've made huge improvements, but the stigma for the British bikes, like the anecdotes I gave you earlier, absolutely true. Just like goofy stuff.
So in your mind,
I have examples if you'd like.
Yeah, I want to hear examples.
Well, yeah, but yeah.
As an example, on early Triumphs, early being from like 1940 through their failure in the 70s or 80s, they used a centrifugal spinner for the oil to like clean the oil, to get crap out of the oil. It was very common back in the day to not have like a mesh or a paper filter like we have now.
And in Britain, that's a centrifugal. Yeah. A brand like Honda has one inside the clutch hub, and you can access it by pulling the clutch cover out, and you can like scrape all the crud out and clean it, and you've like cleaned your spinner. Triumph's spinner was the gudgeon pin of the crankshaft. So if you wanted to clean your spinner, which was part of regular maintenance, you needed to remove the crankshaft from your motorcycle.
For people that might not be mechanically inclined, Ari, in 60 seconds or less, what is a crankshaft, and why is that hard?
I can do it in less time than that. It's the first thing that goes down the assembly line for an engine. It is the middle of the engine, so you will not.
It should never have to come out of an engine.
Exactly.
It should not. Usually, if there's something wrong with your crankshaft, you get a new motorcycle. So accessing it to do regular maintenance is like
absurd.
That's it's asinine.
That's a great example. That's super fun. And that kind of thing surely led people to not clean their oil spinners, and then it surely led to some engine failures, and then hence the reputation for poor reliability.
Yeah, I think the folks at Triumph were just like, the electronics will take the bike down before the clogged spinner will. But it's the jokes about Lucas are long and colorful, and the funny thing is that in the UK, Lucas provided electronics for all kinds of things, including cars. And like this conversation could be had about the British car industry too, and its decline.
Yeah, right. Yeah, Top Gear's done whole episodes on British Leyland, right, and how unbelievably crappy some of the cars made in Britain were in certain eras, and absolutely, I think so. I guess to summarize a little bit, Ari, not to summarize the whole thing, but just your snapshot of Triumph is interesting to me. It sounds like to you, someone familiar with the modern motorcycle industry and modern motorcycles in general, Triumphs are not unreliable anymore. Someone who is maybe our dad's age and remembers Triumphs being unreliable back then might associate the two, since it's literally the same brand. But because there's such a huge schism between the old Triumph and the new Triumph, it's not really valid anymore.
It's no longer valid. It's no longer accurate. I think there's probably old timers who probably still think Triumphs are unreliable, but for folks our age and younger, we know them as being extremely reliable and well refined.
Well, it doesn't help that a lot of new Triumphs look super old. So it's like pulling at that, like the aesthetic is the same as the thing that burned me 40 years ago. So I might want to be careful with that. You know what I mean?
It left me stranded on the side of the road after dark.
Yeah, exactly. That was the worst second date I ever had.
No, I think it's interesting because like when I brought the Bonneville home, that was in 2005. And, a lot of the reaction that I got from people, at 40 years, 45 to 50-year-old, individuals you talk to were like, I don't know. Like it's kind of you're kind of putting your life in your hands there with whether or not you're gonna be stranded on the side of the road and get hit by a truck or something. I think that stigma still was.
Spurge, have you taken any long trips on that bike at all, or have you?
It's funny that you mention it. I mean, that's entirely another podcast. But take a drink.
I think you've mentioned that on a couple of podcasts.
I think we actually mentioned. I think we mentioned in the last like 3. But no, what I will say is that like they're incredibly reliable. I have 80 something thousand miles on that bike. I know my Triumph Tiger was like 19,000.
What about the Silver Fox? The Silver Fox has
he's got 109,000. on
It's
his
over 100,000 miles on
his-
is it a speed triple?
a speed
It's
triple.
a speed triple.
He
Yeah,
has
it's
an
not even
original.
100,000 miles.
it's not even like a Lopey touring bike. It's like a Street Fighter essentially,
Yeah.
or the
It's
original
remarkable.
one of the original naked kind of Street Fighter bikes. Yeah. So respect to the modern Triumph, I suppose.
But Ari, you touched on something that I think is kind of the holdover here, and yes, the issues with the manufacturing of European motorcycles caused them to be suspect from a mechanical standpoint. But the other thing you hit on was the historical nature of having to get parts from Europe and having to wait months at a time to be able to get parts to repair a motorcycle. And I will say, too, that there is still some holdover there. You mentioned Aprilia and a dealer network. I know that there have been times where if I've needed a part for a Triumph, it's taken 2 to 3 weeks to get certain parts, but I've never really run into problems more than that. But it's not like anything that still is an issue where you're waiting for like months to have parts come over and you have to like write a letter handwritten and mail it and wait for something to show up.
Yeah, well, that's good to hear. I think maybe things are different now with supply chain issues because we've all probably had to wait a long time for some stuff that we've ordered. But yeah, generally speaking, you can get components for those motorcycles. It's just not going to be next day.
It's interesting that there is this holdover, though. Agreed that even I don't know. I have this tickle in the back of my brain. Even as someone who's not had particularly bad luck with the European motorcycle that I've owned, that it's just a thing to keep in mind. I mean, if someone said, gun to your head, do I get a KTM or a Triumph, or do I get a Honda or a Yamaha? Which one's going to be more reliable? What would you guys say?
You hear this all the time in the adventure world, right? Oh, I'm going to get a Yamaha 10 or a 700 because it's going to be more reliable. Like, why would you ride a KTM? They're just not going to be. They're not going to be reliable. Why would you ride a Triumph? You hear it like that's where I think the conversation is still happening the most. I want to take my adventure bike into the middle of nowhere, and I don't want to have to worry about it breaking down.
Right.
And to all those people, and I've had this conversation numerous times, in the motorcycling sphere outside of Revzilla, I've been like, knock on wood, like my 1090 was as dependable, if not more dependable, than any other motorcycle I've ever owned. In
the last Get On Adventure Fest we had, certain European ADV several of them did not function well throughout the entire trip. I'm not gonna name any brands, but
there were. I think we did a lot of damage to a lot of motorcycles on that trip.
Yeah, but we had one that the electronics were wonky on and the bike wouldn't start occasionally, and we had one where the fork seals blew, which wasn't really its fault, and then we had another where I'm pretty convinced the electronic rear suspension was out of whack.
Yeah, I mean, but again, there was a wide breadth of, we were using those bikes as dirt bikes. And
as they were designed?
I would say we were probably pushing the limit of what those bikes are capable of in some ways.
So, I mean, you touch on something also that I think is potentially, Ari, you touched on this before, and Spurgeon, you sort of mentioned something that I think bears summarizing, which is that perhaps though a European motorcycle in this day and age is not more likely to like put a hole in a piston than a Japanese bike, the engine to blow up or something to completely fail. Perhaps they are more complicated than their Japanese counterparts sometimes. And if you have if you have a Japanese adventure bike that's fairly simple, and you have a European version that's comparable that has a more complicated dash, or it has a key fob, or it has electronic suspension, if and when something goes wrong with that, it's something that wouldn't have gone wrong with the, say, for argument's sake, the Japanese bike. And I'm not saying that this is necessarily justified, but that is the kind of thing that can perpetuate the stigma that European brands perhaps earned in part because of the stuff we've talked about so far.
Once the stigma exists, which it surely does, all it takes is like one anecdote.
Right.
Well,
like, my friend Bobby, he had a
yeah, exactly.
Well, I would say specifically to the point that Ari was making, on that trip, we had a Tiger 900 that blew out fork seals, but we also had a Yamaha Tenere 700 that blew out fork seals, and the whole suspension was like destroyed. But it all came back to like, oh yeah, the Triumph, I can't believe it blew its fork seals out and blah, 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 blah. Meanwhile, nobody made comments about the person that was riding the Triumph had already scrapped his Yamaha and was like now moving on to the Triumph.
So it sounds like you had a person who was blowing fork seals more than you had bikes.
Kyle Nagel. I'm calling him out over there on the Rever side of things. But no, what I will say is that like it doesn't mean that like from time to time there's not poor designs. So to Ari's point, we had gotten a brand new Tiger 1200, and the issue that we had with it was the bike wouldn't start, and we were trying batteries and key fobs, and we were trying to figure all this out. The design of the clutch switch on that motorcycle is such that you pull the clutch in, and there's a little tab of metal that sits in between the switch and the lever, and the tab had gotten bent because it's an adventure motorcycle and it takes beatings. And when you would pull the clutch in, it wouldn't push the switch in and the bike wouldn't start. And we were calling like Triumph techs, and we were on the phone with Triumph support, and no one could figure this out. Patrick Garvin came out, and Patrick Garvin was like, I figured it out. Little piece of metal wasn't touching. If you pull the piece of metal in, it works fine. So, but like it was a bad design. And like that absolutely was something that like hopefully Triumph will fix in the future.
Well, hopefully they'll fix that whole having to pull the clutch in to start their bike thing anyway, because that's super annoying.
It is annoying.
But that's not, Triumph's not the only one that has a clutch switch you have to pull in to start the bike.
They have a very strange timing mechanism that is always, it's variable. No, not literally, but like we've always been frustrated by Triumphs where like you have to pull the clutch in, and sometimes you pull the clutch in and you press the start and it starts right away, and sometimes you have to pull the clutch in for 2.5 seconds. It's very unpredictable, unlike other bikes where it seems consistent.
Are there what other bike can you guys think of where if you're in neutral on the side stand, you can't just start the bike?
I feel like there has to be some.
No, that's a good point.
I mean, I agree.
That's why
if
Triumph
someone
stands out.
Does Triumph if Triumph is in neutral, the bike won't start? If I go out to the Tiger 900 that we have here, it won't start in neutral?
Correct. You got to pull the clutch in.
Can you go check? You got to go check.
I'll have to check. I'm gonna check on that.
We'll wait.
Anyway, I think that Ari's summary of Triumph is kind of how I feel in general about how brands like KTM, Triumph, BMW, like maybe some European brands did have a reputation at some point, but I don't think it necessarily translates to the modern era. But certainly there are
exceptions
things
to all
that come
rules.
up, and as Ari said, if the stigma exists, then all it takes is one thing to perpetuate it, basically. And so, is it a blunder of European motorcycling that there's this stigma around high maintenance costs or lack of reliability? Yeah, and you can't point to one brand or one person or one thing, but it exists and it's there whether we like it or not. I think.
Like when the KTM 790s came out, for example, they were blowing out the rear shocks because I think the story was they overfilled the rear shocks. So after like 1,000 miles
as well, right?
I don't know. Maybe they care. I thought they solved it by the time the 890 came out.
I think the 890 Rally is actually the worst one. That one's really dangerous.
How dare you?
I think it
has. How dare you, psycho?
Okay,
let's move on.
We have a section. We have a section here that we labeled dishonorable mentions, and we wanted to touch at the end of this podcast about any bikes that we would like to throw on the Moto Blunder bus. Basically, any bikes that we think like, yeah, that deserves a real black eye, a real smear from high side, low side.
We've shish kebabbed a lot of motorcycles at this point.
I agree.
We've talked a lot of smack on stuff.
I agree. And in general, I hope it goes without saying that we here at High Side, Low Side, and Revzilla in general love motorcycles, and we like having fun on them, and we're not here to make any enemies with any particular brands or owners, but I think that what we've talked about has been kind of legitimate and an interesting little touch on history points.
So the 81 Triumph 750 Tiger Trail was the one that I was going to talk about. Was the one I mentioned earlier. If you haven't looked that up, that was their response to the GS at the time, which was basically just like the exact same bike they were already producing with like a fork gator and a high and a high
fender?
Front fender. Thank you.
Beak?
That's the word I was looking for. Fender.
It just looks like a massive dirt bike.
But the one that I wanted to call out that I haven't already previously talked about was the BMW C1. Remember the scooter that we talked about in the ugly episode with the seatbelt?
Yeah, I think that was my pick for the ugliest motorcycle of all time, I think, wasn't it?
I think
What is it? I'm not sure.
You educated me on that, but I think that I would say that was probably a blunder or dishonorable mention, if nothing else.
Yeah. No, I can understand the outlook there. I think the thing that I like about the C1, which for those of you who don't know a BMW C1, I'll try and paint you a picture. It's basically a scooter that has a roof. That has a
canopy.
It has a canopy that goes over, so you sit on it like you sit on a motorcycle, and you put your feet on the ground. There are no
And
doors
you wear
or
a
anything.
seatbelt.
But yeah, you sit in a seat, and there's a roof, and there's a windshield wiper, and a whole like canopy that goes over you. So if it's raining in your commute across Berlin, you don't get wet. It's very strange looking. It's worth looking up. The thing about that bike that, and I think listing it under a blunder is totally fair, but you might have had people putting money on the GS being a blunder in 1981 also. What is this huge dirt bike? It's so stupid.
They did. Yeah, there's plenty of people who didn't think it was going to work and it was a bad idea.
So I occasionally, when a bike seems really dumb, I think I have a part of me wants to at least applaud a little bit and say, well, you tried something.
Yeah.
I don't know. And if it had taken off, that would have been cool or something. I don't know.
It would have been something, but it wouldn't have been cool. That thing looks ridiculous.
That's fair. So a bike I wanted to call out, and in this section was what did I say it was called? It's for this Ducati 500 GTL.
Oh yeah.
So it was Ducati parallel twins in the 70s. They made some parallel twins, and for any modern or even perhaps any Ducatisti, they would be an abomination. Something they would wish to wipe from the history books entirely, but they did it. Ducati,
it's something I could see them bringing back as like a modern classic now because it has a classic kind of Ducati look to it.
I mean, they're good-looking bikes. I think they're kind of handsome. It just
they look like Moto Guzzi's.
Yeah. I would say they look like looks like a Triumph that parallel twin down there,
or like a Triton.
They've got a very angular tank and bodywork. It's got a look to it. You think they called the parallel twin an I twin since they call their V twin an L twin?
So I had it was a company Slack channel actually. You guys were talking about MotoGP or something, and someone was like, I didn't know the MotoGP bikes were V4s. I thought Ducatis were twins, and then someone had to educate them and say like, no, the MotoGP bikes are V4s, and the street bikes have often been twins, even though now they have V4s in the street bikes now. And then someone said the street bikes, something, they're L twins, and now they're V4s. And I was like, well, why isn't it an L4? How come it's L twin and not L4? Like, what is
it
this?
A 90-degree V4? Is it still 90?
It is, yeah. So the person in their defense pointed out that the V4 Ducatis are more, the 90-degree V is more upright, so it makes it look more like a V.
It looks like an L. Yeah.
Whereas the classic Ducatis are like the front cylinder's laid right down.
Front
so it looks
cylinder's
kind of
almost
like an L.
pointing straight forward.
I still think it's a marketing abomination to call it.
It only looks like an L if you're looking at it from the right side. So if they just gone V, it could have been left or right.
Because if you look at it from the other side, then it's some sort of backwards Russian letter or something. I don't know.
Ari, any dishonorable mentions on your part that you want to?
I think I've doled out enough lumps in this podcast. I'm feeling like kind of a negative guy crapping on a bunch of British bikes. So no, I feel like we've covered the bases.
Okay. Well then, if you have nothing else, I think we'll move along. I'm sure we could probably drum up some additional ones if we wanted to, but I would say that for those of you listening, if you have any dishonorable mentions that you feel like we haven't hit on as far as European bikes, feel free to throw them in the comments below or shoot us an email. Closing things out before we jump into the engine sound guessing game, what are any potential mistakes that we see in the future? Any things that we see as a
from Europe, from the European brands?
Yeah, from the European brands.
Like what's a sort of like whatever, like styling or business or whatever landmine that they might step on, the European motorcycle industry as a whole, right? That's the question.
Yeah. Like when we did, for example, when we did this with the American side of things, we had talked about the fact that like there seemed to be a push on the HD side to kind of crush or curtail some of the innovation on the electric side. So that was kind of what we talked about with the American.
Is
side
that what we
of things.
said?
Didn't we talk about that?
Harley made Livewire.
Yeah, but they also did the whole thing with Alta.
That's true. And Victory bought Bramo, and that didn't. So that's probably what we're talking about. Anyway, whatever. So anything come to mind, Ari, for European moto industry to look out for in the future, that mistakes that might be made?
I don't know if it'll be an intentional mistake, but I feel like they're always the European restrictions, like the regulations, are always kind of a step ahead and seemingly very stringent. So that could be something that could stymie their development. Where they're just like, instead of investing R&D effort and dollars into better technologies or better motorcycles, they might just have to funnel that money toward making the bikes cleaner and quieter, and basically to make them meet emissions, they might have to divert effort, which could perhaps inhibit development of new products.
Right. I think that's an interesting take. I think the counterpoint to that would be, it's two sides of the same coin. You perhaps stymie moving forward in a direction that certain enthusiasts would appreciate, whatever high horsepower gas burning things. But on the other hand, it might turn into
them.
Yeah, might benefit
you end up
European
with
brands
the only people with bikes in dealerships
because they have to innovate and they have to be ahead of the curve and they have to follow trends in the automotive industry. Blah blah blah. I don't know, but yeah, I mean we're not seeing any.
It's a tough question.
Yeah, it is a tough question. Spurs,
So
you got
I'm
anything?
curious
Zach,
to hear what you guys say.
I would say, Zach, did you have anything that you wanted to hit on for this one?
I wonder sometimes, and I think this is really reaching, but I wonder if there isn't sometimes a clinging to the heritage brands in Europe because there's so much history there and because there's so much to lean on that would keep brands from moving forward, right? Like it would, instead of where in I don't know, in Asia or the subcontinent, it seems to me that there's an attitude of move forward, technology, next big thing. We're going to make a new company that's going to be a motorcycle startup, and it's going to be the next thing. It's going to be the next electric bike, whatever it is. And that's certainly a flawed outlook as well. But is it not maybe a flawed outlook to keep on pouring money into a brand like Norton? Not that I don't think Nortons are majestic bikes and have an amazing history, but is that not a misguided thing to do, to just for people to keep trying to revive that brand and have it not work because it's an antiquated notion?
Some rich guy will also always come back. There's always going to be someone with more money than sense.
Right. But that's to me like something that could be seen as a negative thing as a whole for European motorcycling, that people would cling to that too much and not say we're just going to do the next thing instead of looking back.
Up until Ducati came out with the V4, they were stymied by tradition, right? Like they were stuck on the L twin, and the Desmo, whereas now you've got like the Multistrada that's got conventional valve train and 36 or 37,000 mile intervals. And I think that would have been a good example, but they have now broken out of that shell, thankfully, and are coming up with
and they've
cool
got
stuff.
an electric superbike that they're working on. So credit to Ducati. The big guy, I think they got their heads screwed on straight to a certain extent, and they just won the World Superbike Championship and the MotoGP World Championship, so they're doing something right over there in Borgo Panigale.
It makes you wonder too, from a styling exercise, if it's right or wrong, because like when you think about Triumph, like one of the most successful bikes that they've had in the modern era has been, a bike that looks like it's 50 years old.
True. 100%.
Then you had BMW chase that. You had Ducati chase that. So
I mean, Triumph jump-started that entire fad, which has lasted.
No. Kawasaki jump-started that entire fad with the W650, and it failed.
But that was, exactly. So they didn't jump-start it. They just tried.
They tried. But I would say Triumph is the ones that stuck with it until it took off.
Yeah, that's fair.
And they had the sort of Steve McQueen aesthetic to lean back on and get people interested in it, which ended up working.
Yeah.
But
so
good discussion, you guys. This has been fun.
I think it's time for an engine sound guessing game, though.
Yes, let's do this.
Okay. Something.
Okay, so for those of you
remind me the rules, please.
Yeah, if you don't know the drill, if you're listening to the game for the first time, you're going to play along with Zach Quartz and Ari Henning and myself.
Yes.
We have sourced an engine sound. We are going to listen to about 25 seconds of this engine sound, and then we're going to try and take a guess at what we think it is. We also have 3 hints along the way, should we need them. I'm sorry, Chase is correcting me. We have 2 hints along the way, should we need them. And without any further ado, gentlemen, start your engines.
Huh.
Aries
Damn.
looking like he knows.
Yeah, I know. You
I
look
thought
very
I
confident.
did. The starter motor, and then I hear an exhaust valve opening and or closing. Those are so telling. But then like I had an idea, and it got away from me.
Yeah. Yeah, the first 3 seconds of it, for some reason, I was like, I'm going to get this. And then as it went
Totally.
on, I thought, I don't know what that is.
And I'm also there's like a tickle of a memory in my brain where I know I've heard that exhaust valve close after startup, and I just can't remember what the bike is.
All right. Well, in an effort
Ooh.
to keep things moving along, we are gonna. I'm gonna throw out the first hint because.
Well, hang on. We can make some progress
First,
here. It's a
first
twin,
hint
right?
is that it's not a single.
Yeah.
It's a twin?
It's
We
a twin.
agreed?
It's a twin.
Okay.
Okay.
And I think it's... I can't
think
say it's a... Go ahead.
I think it's a 270.
You think it's a 270 parallel twin?
I think it's a 270 crank. It sounds like a parallel
I think,
twin to me.
Can I throw a guess out there, even though I think it's probably gonna be wrong?
Go for it.
Yeah.
Either the Touareg or the RS660.
Okay.
I don't know. I think this sounds more.
This version doesn't like it.
It just sounds. It sounds older to me. It sounds. Go ahead, Zach. What do you think?
I don't know. Gosh.
All right, well, let's do a hint just to
Yeah,
keep
let's do
things
a hint.
moving here.
I need a hint.
Yeah.
I got nothing.
Hint number one. Oh, it is a liquid cooled
see?
V twin.
Interesting.
V-twin.
A liquid cooled
Okay.
V twin.
Liquid cooled V twin.
hear-
That
it's
doesn't
got
narrow it
that-
down that much.
It's got that kind of tinny rattle to it, though.
Yeah.
So
And I don't...
Cooled. So I don't know if that's an exhaust valve or if it's just someone getting in front of the microphone, but it's totally tripping me up.
What if it's a really small... Like when it revs up, it sounds little to me.
Yeah, it doesn't sound like it's got a lot of displacement.
So maybe like a Honda VTR 250 or like
Hawk, perhaps?
a Honda Hawk.
Oh, Hawk.
I don't know. I don't know what Hawk sounds like.
Was the
Nah,
Hawk?
I bet
Was it a
it's-
400?
No, it was a
650.
500, I think. Was it 650?
Yeah.
650?
And I know how we come up with these. We basically everyone in the network gets asked for bikes, and I happen to know that Jen's husband has a Hawk 650 in the garage. So like,
No,
it
these
could
are
be a
listener
Hawk.
submitted. These are listener
really?
submitted. Yeah.
Not all of them though, right?
Not historically all of them, but since we've started
okay, 'cause-
soliciting, we've gotten them.
Okay.
Gotcha.
Hint number two.
But if that turns out to be true, I'm gonna be sad that you figured it out that way.
Hint number two is Rotax 990 engine.
Oh. Well, it's a KTM, right? And it's like, what else would have that
It's
engine?
so quiet. It's a 990.
That's the
Yeah, I wouldn't have
hint.
guessed it was that big.
Oh wait, producer Chase just threw an impromptu hint number 3 on my desk because we're not doing good.
No.
This is not fair. Hint number 3 does not have 2 wheels.
Oh, so it's a
What?
KTM crossbow
We're playing an engine sound guessing game.
or not a
I'm just-
crossbow?
Yeah. What's that? Yeah.
It
Yes.
is-
Okay, that's
Oh,
exactly
so
what it is. Zach.
is it a Can-Am?
all right. The
what's
answer
crossbow, right?
is I would have never guessed this. It is a 2000. It's not a crossbow. That's a great guess. For those of you listening,
That was
that was
Zach
the
who connected those
KTM.
dots.
Yeah, that was the KTM version of a. Yeah.
Well, I think the crossbow might actually been the car thing.
Was it 4-wheeled? Yeah, you're
Yeah,
right.
that's
You're
what it
right.
was. Come
yeah.
on. Then what's the
Yep.
3-wheel that had the Rotax?
Well, Ari's Googling, so I'm going to give the answer out. So the answer is a 2011 Can-Am Spyder RT-S.
Okay, the Can-Am.
I'm not disappointed that I didn't get that.
So the source,
Interesting.
the source today is from Scott G, aka Prodigal Stranger. Scott is a frequent listener and a frequent commenter.
Okay.
He also sent me and Nicole t-shirts. Oh, is this the t-shirts that are on my desk right now? Interesting. I have t-shirts on my desk, but I had
Super fan.
But no, it's interesting because I had a friend who said, "Hey, I sent you mail." So I have these 2 T-shirts on my desk. One is like a picture of a turkey and like just poor like sauce all over me or something like that. And I thought it was my buddy Carlos that's sending these T-shirts, but apparently it's Scott G.
Is it? Are you're into T-shirts version? Is that a thing?
I like a good T-shirt. Yeah,
I know the one you're wearing is fantastic.
Yeah, for those of you listening that can't see it, I have a T-shirt on with the dinosaurs that are wearing Hawaiian shirts, and it says the bodacious period. The T-Rex is giving thumbs up and wearing a fanny pack. Anyway, so Scott says his name was Wayne. He's actually from Wayne, New Jersey. I don't know why you're giving me all this information.
So much
Jesus
confusion.
Christ. Spurgeon, stay focused here.
No,
what are you talking
Our
about?
producer Chase is over here, and he's just like, stop, don't talk anymore. But I'm just reading what you gave me. If he gives me a piece of paper, I'm going to read it. So anyway.
Okie dokie, Ron Burgundy. We're going to move right along.
Yeah.
It was a Can-Am Spider, and we did not see that coming because we were mostly thinking of two-wheeled vehicles. However, I would like to point out that when a Can-Am Spider goes the other way on the road, I do try my level best to wave because you got the wind in your hair. I know it's not a motorcycle. I know the three wheels are controversial, but you're out there. You're doing it to a certain extent, and I do appreciate that.
Well, you
Do
stumped
you
us all,
wave to
Scott.
them proactively, or do you just wave back if they wave?
I think we need to move on.
I think that was a great episode. Thank you to Scott. For anybody else that has an engine sound, please feel free to shoot us an email to highside@revzilla.com with a 30-second clip of your engine sound. Start it up. Ari likes to hear, the starter whirling because that's how he makes his guesses. And you got to let it
Absolutely.
idle a little bit, and you got to give it a few good revs so we can hear the thing breathing a little bit of fire. But for right now, Ari, I think it's time we let you get back to your regular scheduled program. And Zach and I are going to jump into some T-shirt winners and some comments.
Right on, guys. That was a lot of fun.
Agreed. Thanks for hanging out. See you, man.
See you, bud.
See ya.
Always a pleasure having Mr. Ari Henning on the program. But Zach, I think it's time we give away a T-shirt.
Yes, indeed. Way too many T-shirts over here, as usual. So who's the winner this time, Spurgeon Dirge?
The winner today is Two Wheel Newbie.
Two-wheel newbie. Right.
Two
We
Wheel
like
Newbie
giving
left
away.
us a Apple Podcast review, and that's how you too, listener, can win. And I notice I said listener singular, the one person that's out there listening to our podcast right now. You can win yourself a T-shirt if you leave us a review over on the Apple Podcast app. It helps other people find the show, and it helps to make the show better because we read your feedback.
Indeed. And we do like giving away T-shirts to so-called newbies also because we want to encourage the two-wheel lifestyle and pastime. So yeah, Two-Wheel Newbie wrote in and said, I signed up for a champ school session on my birthday weekend 2023 while listening to season 6, episode 6, first track day. Love the episode and the show in general. Very approachable show and not in least bit gatekeepy. I'm not sure exactly what that means. Keep up with the good work, y'all. Thank you so much, Two-Wheel Newbie. And we are so thrilled that you signed up for a track day. And I think Champ School is short for Yamaha Champions Riding School. Is that right, Spurgeon, as far as you understand
I'm
it?
guessing that. And Jen actually has a great article on this too. So if you want to read more about what Champ School is, you can check out Jen Dunstan's article.
Indeed. Well, anyway, if you get to Champ School wearing your high side, low side T-shirt and they throw you out immediately, I'm sure we have no idea what happened.
So shoot an email over to highside@revzilla.com with your address where you would like your shirt sent to, as well as your shirt size, and we will get one sent out in time for your Champ School weekend in 2023.
Yes, indeed. And happy learning. So the first comment we're going to tackle, Mr. Spurge, is from one Kevin, if that even is their real name. Kevin says, now I know you all have stated the generic disclosure that dual sport or adventure riding is as much a mindset as it is a vehicle. Good statement, Kevin.
Have we stated that? Was that something that we've said?
I think so. I think Kevin's right. And that sounds like a very astute and handsome thing to say, so I assume we said it. Why do you guys not consider ADV bikes with 19-inch front wheels and 17-inch rear wheels and sport touring foundations and approximately 6 inches of suspension? Why do you not consider those bikes a proper mount for dual sport application? Isn't that enough to have some fun on slow speed, sightseeing on fire roads? This isn't a knock on you guys or to disagree. Just want to give my experience and perspective on that subject. Spurge, was this something you talked about with Spencer and dual sports bike?
I don't remember. I mean, Kevin does go on to say that he doesn't want to whoop and roost around. He would pick a smaller bike for that. I think that there are plenty of examples of a bike with a 19-inch front wheel, BMW R1250 GS, that are awesome adventure bikes. I think that it's just
Yeah.
a matter of like, what do you want your adventure bike to do, and how far off road do you want to go with it?
You know what bike has a 19-inch front wheel? A 1969 Yamaha DT1. And I'll be damned if you're going to tell me that that's not a dirt bike. So if anyone comes at you, Kevin, and says that real dirt bikes can't have 19-inch front wheels, you just point them in the direction of that 50-year-old dual sport, and you tell them that we at High Side Low Side said that it was okay. Jokes aside, or whatever, silly statistics aside, there is, as you said at the beginning, Kevin, dual sport or adventure riding is a mindset more than it is based on the vehicle. And I don't think that we have ever, in my knowledge, we have never purposefully said that an ADV bike with a 19-inch front wheel and a sport touring foundation is an improper bike for a dual sport application. You can absolutely, I mean, I've seen a Kawasaki Versus 650 with a 17-inch front wheel with knobby tires on it up to its axles in a river. I feel like
we've used that example quite often because my buddy Ryan Wheatley
Right.
has had the Versus 650 that he has done things that people on proper adventure bikes, if we're going to, say that something with a 21-inch front wheel is more quote unquote proper, air quotes. I think you can do a lot depending on what your ability is.
Absolutely. And I think I appreciate this comment from Kevin because it was not confrontational. Kevin said that I understand you've stated these things in the past. I just sort of wanted to clarify. And I think this is a good clarification that riding off-road is there's a spectrum of mindsets and a spectrum of bikes that are appropriate. You can take a Suzuki GSX-R 600 down a dirt road if you want to. You're not necessarily going to crash. There aren't hard and fast rules. There are people that are super into adventure riding and they like the outfits and they like the saddlebags and they like the tires and they might try to tell you that you need a certain bike to do a certain thing. But in this spectrum that you're talking about, Kevin, you absolutely should use that motorcycle to have an adventure, in my opinion.
They're all adventure bikes if you're willing to try. That's all that matters.
Any bike is an adventure bike as long as you're dumb enough.
So, Kevin, hopefully that gives you a little bit of insight into how Zach and I feel. It's definitely a spectrum. I would agree with Zach on that one. So let's move along to comment number 2, which is from Sam. And Sam writes in and says, "You have me convinced. I definitely want to do a track day to learn and push my limits, and I'm not worried about looking stupid or slow. In my case, both are chronic conditions anyway." Way to go, Sam. You're in good company with both Zach and myself. But I don't think anyone mentioned the one thing that is stopping Sam, which is I don't want to crash my bike. Since the point is to push my limits to become a better rider, it seems that by definition, you don't find out where your limit is until after you cross it and end up on the gravel. Seems like you're asking for a large repair or replacement bill, and as a cheapskate, that financial hit does worry Sam. Also read horror stories about people in the United States calling their carrier about whether track days are covered by insurance, having insurance canceled. Is there a track-only insurance that Sam could have, or is the only answer to just suck it up and try not to crash? So, Zach, what do you think? What do you think for Sam?
Well, this is appropriate coming from Kevin's question because this is about a mindset as well. Because in some ways, Sam, you are correct. It is a risk to take your motorcycle and not to mention your body to a racetrack and quote unquote push your limits. But I think the reason that we are so encouraging of it is that the limit that gets pushed shouldn't necessarily be crashing your bike. Hopefully, the thing that is, I'm going to paint a picture for you here, and hopefully this helps describe a sort of wider theory about why this is a good idea. You go to a racetrack and you're riding around and you're leaning over and you're thinking, okay, I can lean over a little bit more. I can lean over a little bit more. I can brake a little bit later into that corner. I can go faster. I can experiment with the performance of my motorcycle in a way that I would not feel comfortable on a public road. And that is the whole point. When you do go past that limit, what I think you will find more likely to happen than completely MotoGP yard sailing your bike is running wide in a corner, going off the track at relatively low speed into the grass, into the gravel, and not tipping over at all, but just screwing up. And if you're going to screw up like that, doing it in a closed course and in an environment that is designed for that type of behavior, it's so much safer than doing it on the street. And not to mention, you'll be surrounded by other people that are like-minded and interested in learning, and there might be instructors, what have you. The point is, I think as long as your personality is, I don't know, up for the responsibility of it, there shouldn't, the line shouldn't be between not experimenting with your limit or crashing. That shouldn't be it. You should be able to experiment with your limit safely. And is there a risk of the bike tipping over? 100%. Absolutely. And I think you should be prepared for that sort of financial hardship. But I think that there's more to be gained from it than maybe you're appreciating, having maybe not done it before.
What I would say, just to go a little bit further, Sam, I think what's more than likely to happen as you go through a corner and you push your limit is that you realize that you are so far from the limit of the motorcycle that motorcycle doesn't yard sail into a gravel pit, that you don't go flying off the track. You realize that you have much more lean angle to go before you even come to the limit of your motorcycle. I think there is a way to go to a track day and ease yourself into it and push your boundaries, and still, for most of us, we're still not pushing the boundaries of what the motorcycle is capable of. And there's a way to do that in a very comfortable and safe way at a track day. If you are concerned about wrecking your personal motorcycle, there are certain track day organizations that you can rent a motorcycle at. I know Evolve GT in New Jersey, where we go, you can rent Ninja 300s and Ninja 400s. You can rent the gear. You don't have to go out and make a huge investment in gear right away if you don't want to. You can rent a tracksuit. You can rent the gloves, the boots, yada, yada, yada. Your other alternative, Sam, would be to go to a school like California Superbike School. And you can rent a motorcycle from the school. And that way you're not using your own personal motorcycle. You show up, the bike is already prepped for the track for you. It's got the appropriate tires on, you hop on and you ride. But I would just say that I think all of your concerns are valid. This is an expensive risk that we're all taking. But I think that the reward far outweighs the risk, and you can easily find the limit of your limitations before finding the limit of the machines. That's where I'd leave it at.
I like it. A t-shirt given away, 2 comments and questions addressed. Hopefully Kevin and Sam are satisfied, as are the rest of you, the way that we answered that question and found some knowledge or encouragement in there somewhere. This is where we remind you to leave a comment below if you're watching on YouTube. Send us an email if you have a comment to highside/lowside@revzilla.com. You can send us your engine sounds along with the year, make, model, and mods of your motorcycle and a 30-second clip of the bike starting up and running. But to be honest, we got a lot of engine sounds. Chase says we got a lot of engine sounds these days. So feel free to send us comments, questions, concerns to highside/lowside@revzilla.com. And we're almost done there, eh, Spurge?
Yeah. I think if I had to sum up what I've learned today.
Yeah. What did you take from today, Spurge?
I have learned that despite some of the criticism that we have received in the past, we have successfully been able to, attack European motorcycle manufacturers and highlight some of their blunders the same way we did with American manufacturers.
I agree. I think there might have been a slightly different tone, if I'm being perfectly honest, to the whole conversation. But my takeaway was similar, Spurge. I didn't think I was going to have so much shade to throw at European brands. But if you think about it, there have been mistakes, large and small, and certainly they were worth talking about. So I hope everyone got a kick out of that discussion.
My point of saying that was Zach and I got a comment last season about of course you did one on American motorcycle blunders. You'll never do any more. This is just you throwing shade at American manufacturers. So I think
you guys hate America.
Yeah, it was really important for Zach and I to do the next in the series for this. And the next in the series was to take a historical look at, what has come out of Europe and for all the wins and for the fact that Zach and I both have European motorcycles in our garages. They haven't always been wins. There's been some flops along the way. Hopefully this was entertaining and educational. And if you want more information, there's plenty of books out there that you can buy and you can educate yourself much more in depth on some of the wins and the losses over the past years my books just happen to be all Triumph in nature that I have on the table with me, but there's a lot of great literature out there.
Okie doke, everybody. Thank you so much for hanging out. That's it for episode 9 of season 6. Hopefully we'll see you next time, and please do ride safe.